Welcome back to Faith Seeking and Standing Online. I am your host, Matt, and I'm joined with Roland. We're answering your questions. So if you had any questions on the Patriarch video, then this is the place where we're going to be talking about them. This is an ongoing thing through our module. So for every talk, we will release the lesson on the Tuesday, and you can ask your questions during the week. We've got our next one coming out tomorrow, so don't forget to get your questions in before the Saturday when we record these. So we're gonna think about some of the questions that have come in. We've only got two, but we'll see how we go. Last time I spoke for like 17 minutes on one question, so
yeah, two might be too much. We might not have enough time for two.
We'll see how we go. Anything you want to say before we get going?
No, let's dive in.
Cool. I think I should give the usual disclaimer that I've got a baby, and so you might hear some noises. Okay, so the first question, you mentioned the promises to Abraham about descendants and blessing, and how these are fulfilled in Jesus. But what about the land? Is that also fulfilled in Jesus, and how?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question because, well, it's interesting for a number of things. The reason we didn't talk about it in the talk is because we were focusing on Abraham as the patriarch, and so that has to do with descendancy primarily. That's part of the reason. The second reason is that the New Testament authors don't speak about the land, at least as land, very much. And so that, I mean, you can look at Galatians 3 as an example. We spend a lot of time in Galatians 3 in the talk, and in the chapter, he talks about the blessing to Abraham, the blessing promised to Abraham, and the descendants, because that's where we got a lot of our ideas from. But he doesn't mention the land anyway, which is really surprising. In fact, if you go, it's really hard to find passages in the New Testament where they would explicitly and like unambiguously talking about the land.
Which is strange, because I think when we think of the promises made to Abraham in Genesis 12, I think at least in the circles we move in, we're pretty used to summing them up. And Abraham was promised three things: land, people, blessing. So like, that's 1/3 of what he was promised there. Like, how does that just kind of get forgotten?
Yeah. It's like what starts them as well, right? So he says like, go to this land that I'm about to show you. And then he like gives the stuff. Yeah, it is quite interesting. So we can ask two questions then, I guess. There's two. The first is what happens to the promise of the land, and then the second is why do the New Testament authors not speak about it a lot, or as much as they speak about blessing and descendants? So, and they're both really good questions. So, okay, on the first question is what happens to the promise of the land? I think here we want to say Jesus, like all the promises, Jesus fulfills it, and he not only fulfills it in the sense of brings it to completion or something, as in like you fulfill a promise, but he fulfills it by filling it out, right? He fully fills it, which is a sort of fulfillment that we discussed quite a lot, I think, in our first module on biblical theology when we make sense of things.
So if you're listening and you want to go back and find out more about fulfillment, then we talk about it in our first module, the second lesson, where we thought about types and other tools.
That's it. Yeah, I couldn't remember where we spoke about it, but that one. So, and that's sort of how he does it for the blessing and the descendants, right? So he fills out the blessing in the sense that he makes it accessible throughout the world, and he fills out the descendants in the sense that he makes it, Jesus makes it possible for all the nations to become descendants of Abraham, which is what we discussed in the talk. He does the same thing with the land, and I should say also, he does it in an already not yet kind of way, like he does a lot of his things, right? So there's some taste of it we have now, and then we get the culmination of that in when he returns one day. So the senses that he fills it out are this: God's people, or Abraham's descendants, now no longer live just in one restricted place on the earth, but we live throughout the earth. So the land in which God lives with his people, has his temple, because his people are his temple, is now Canaan, but everywhere. It's Canaan because it's the whole world, not Canaan because we're only in this one place. And so he's filled it out in that sense. And similarly, Jesus is king over everything now. So he's reigning over everything. In fact, he's reigning over the entire cosmos and all creation. But that minimally includes Canaan as well. So he's fulfilled it, but in this like bigger way, more than you would possibly imagine.
And sure, more than the Israelites would have imagined.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because for them, I think they were. Well, yeah, we'll get to that. But like they because they do have the sense of like the whole world, a cosmic restoration and so on in the exile. But at least in the beginning, when they were from the promise to Abraham to the claiming of the land and then living in the land with the kingdom of Israel, they kind of thought about it as like a fixed boundary. And then, so that's the already now, right? So already now, Abraham's descendants are throughout the world, and Jesus already reigns over everything. But it's also kind of incomplete at the moment, so that's why we have the not yet situation. And the reason is that we're not the only ones living all over the world, right? So Abraham's descendants are the church now, spiritual descendants are the church. But obviously, we're not the only ones living in the world. It's not like exclusively our property, if you could say it that way. And Jesus is reigning over everything, but there still remains things to be put under his feet. So 1 Corinthians will talk about how death still needs to be put under his feet in the final day and so on. And so in the new heavens and the new earth, that's what we're looking forward to, where all of creation is restored and like made even greater than it was. And there's no uncleanness or sin or death or mourning or anything like that. So you have what we have now in like the fullest form, where we live of everything and it's sort of exclusively ours, if you could say it like that. Kind of how it was in Canaan, but then over all of creation.
It makes me think of the passage in Romans 8, where Paul talks about the way that all creation is being made new, that currently there's this groaning awaiting the sons of God to, or the children of God, let's be more inclusive here, to inherit this new creation. Do you think that has any bearing on the way that we think about the land?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about that passage, I think definitely, that when I think of that passage, the first thing I think of is like original creation, like Eden, were made like new Adams and new Eves, or if you will, but like perfect. But like, I think there is definitely a sense in which you could think of it as in terms of the land, right? Like the promised land was supposed to be like the second Eden. And insofar as all of creation is now in that Romans 8 passage is being restored and under the rule of the children of God, yeah, we're like that would include like the Canaan, if you will, and I think it actually gets referred to as early in chapter 8. We get referred to as like co-heirs with Christ. So the idea of an heir is very reminiscent of the promises to Abraham. So the heir that we spoke a lot in the talk about inheriting the promises or inheriting the responsibility for blessing and so on. And so you also inherit the promises for land and so on. So that's the idea I think that Paul has in mind when he speaks about heir. So he definitely has that in mind. I think the nice thing about it is that, if you think about it in terms of Adam and Eve, and you think about like the perfect restoration, the idea that we have of the new creation or the glory of the sons of God or the children of God, is that we won't lose it again because we'll be remade by the Spirit and we won't be prone to sin and all those sorts of things like Adam and Eve lost Eden. And the same thing, I think you articulated this pretty well in your talk, if I remember correctly. You could think of Israel losing Canaan in their exile as something equivalent to Adam and Eve losing Eden when they got exiled from Eden, right? And so just like in the glory that we're awaiting, we won't lose out on the Eden or any of the new creation. So we won't lose out on the promised land or all of the land that God's people live in. So I think there's lots of connections there. And I think it's in Paul as well, particularly with the language of heir, which comes up in Romans 4 and Romans 8. He definitely has that in mind. It's not just like pulling it out of nowhere.
This is maybe jumping around a bit, but this just made me think of the way that you put it now. It made me think of the end of Revelation, where there's the new creation, painted as a new Eden and a new Jerusalem, and maybe that's something we can pick up on just now. But the alternative, just a chapter or two before, is Babylon. And it has that scene where Babylon is finally dealt the judgment of God, where Babylon is finally dealt with and tossed into the lake of fire. And with it, with Babylon, everybody who chose her. It kind of brings the Bible story full circle, that there's a permanent exile awaiting those who just continue to refuse God and the blessings that he offers.
And that is definitely, I think that the revelation is definitely like connecting that with the promised land. Because when you think of Babylon from an exiled Israel's perspective, you're thinking you're in Babylon, you're in exile, and what you want in terms of restoration is to go back to the land, go back to the place where you were living with God, go back to that relationship. And so then in Revelation, we're seeing that in this like filled out sense happening, and in these ultimate terms, as you mentioned correctly. Yeah. So that brings us actually to the second thing, which is, why don't the New Testament authors speak about this? You'll actually be hard pressed to find places in the New Testament that talk about the promise of land as the promise of land. Like, in Galatians, it talks about Abraham's promised blessing and Abraham's descendants, and Paul will quote, you'll be the father of many nations. He quotes that in Romans 4. So he's like talking about those promises. But he never really talks about the land promises. The two passages I've seen people like try and quote as like references to this are, there's one in Matthew 5 verse 5 where Jesus says I think it's like the meek will inherit the earth, which maybe, and there's one in Romans 4 verse 13 where he says, Paul says Abraham, the promise to Abraham that he'd become the heir of the world. He refers to that. But even there in Romans 4, it's probably more likely referring to the blessings, that his blessings he will be the source of blessing for the entire world, rather than, somehow Canaan will be encompassed all of the world or something. It's not really clear. The bit that he quotes later in Romans, which is, you'll be the father of a multitude of nations, is from Genesis 22. And that's pretty explicitly talking about the blessing. So, or the blessing or his descendants, I guess, the number of descendants he has. So the question then is why don't the New Testament authors speak about this? Yeah. And this answer actually, the answer is inspired by what Graham Goldsworthy says in his book, Gospel and Kingdom, which is the first one in this trilogy. I think we mentioned it quite a bit in our first talk.
In the description below, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can find the resources that we mention in these videos. Otherwise, they'll be listed in the recommended resources at the bottom of the lesson page on our website. You can find recommended resources from the lessons themselves and from the questions. And I think we might need to update the first lesson, because I'm not sure if all the resources made it there yet, but... Yeah, that's where you can find it if you're interested in chasing up some of the things that we mentioned in these videos.
Yeah, I don't think we put Gospel and Kingdom in the list of resources. Okay, we will put it in. We put it according to plan,
we'll fix it.
Yeah. So he made this comment when I was thinking about this. He made this comment that I thought was really interesting, and it's that, I hope I'm not misrepresenting what he said, because I can't find it now. I won't be able to find it. But... he said, the promise of the land that started with Abraham, over the course of Israel's history, it sort of developed these extra, I don't know what you could say, ways of thinking about it, these extra perspectives on it. And each perspective came with a new sort of language that spoke about the land in a different way. And it's these extra perspectives that became the way that Israel thought about the land, and then also the way that the New Testament authors spoke about the land. So they do speak about the land, just not in the language of the original promise, because it has this long history of development of thought. And so I'll give you some examples, and then you might be able to spot, we'll also go through the New Testament examples, but as I said, then you'll probably be able to think about the cases where they talk about it. So the first really obvious one to me anyway, is in Deuteronomy, I think it's in Deuteronomy. You've done Deuteronomy more recently than you, Matt. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Deuteronomy, I think when they're standing on the edge of the border of the land, and Moses is saying that when they get into the promised land, God is going to give them rest. And there the idea of rest it makes a lot of sense to Israel, because this is a generation that has grown up wandering in the wilderness, no permanent place to live, constantly moving around. And so he's saying you'll have rest from not only this constant motion, you'll be able to live in a place, but also rest from the enemies that are around you, constantly preying on you and wanting to attack God's people. And so the language of rest there is the land becomes this place of rest, of milk and honey, and this place of peace. And that then gets picked up, right? That language of rest gets picked up in Hebrews quite explicitly. Hebrews 4?
3 or 4, let's find out.
Early Hebrews, first half of Hebrews. It gets picked up explicitly there. And it even talks about it in terms of the land, right? So Hebrews 4, cool. It even talks about it in terms of the land, right? It says, if Joshua had really given them rest, then David wouldn't have later spoken about a rest that was still coming. And then Joshua is the person who famously led the conquer of the land of Canaan to take over the promised land. So that's one example. Then once they get into the land and they have a pretty flourishing kingdom, they build the capital, right, in Jerusalem, or they eventually take over Jerusalem, because they don't take it over initially. They eventually take over Jerusalem, and then Jerusalem becomes the capital where the temple is, and it's on Mount Zion. So in a lot of the prophets, you see them speak about, it's particularly when they're talking about how Israel will be restored from exile, they speak about how people will come back to Zion. Israel will live in Zion again, or Jerusalem will be rebuilt, or God will come to his temple again, and there'll be this in Zechariah, it talks about how there'll be this amazing thing where all the nations will come to the temple and speak about and do that, right?
Beginning of Isaiah as well.
Beginning of Isaiah, yeah. And then at the end of Isaiah, you have this language that we just spoke about, where the restoration of Israel is spoken about not just in terms of taking over a plot of land, but in a complete restoration of creation. So there'll be a new heavens and new earth that will be established, right? And so all of these ideas are picked up in the New Testament. So we just said now in Revelation, right, that the New Jerusalem comes out of heaven, and God is with his people, and so on. We have the new heavens and the new earth being described in Revelation, in 2 Peter, and then also, not in that language, but the same idea in Romans 8. So all the authors are actually talking about the land. I think it's just that... I think the problem is that the descendancy and the blessing radically changed with Jesus, and in a way that people weren't necessarily expecting. Whereas the land, we had a bunch of development through Israel's history and through the prophets. And so in Jesus, the New Testament authors were just saying, yeah, the thing that we're waiting for, that's happened now. See?
Yeah. It seems like in the Old Testament, the land is the big point of tension, where from the beginning, there's this move that God has promised the land to Abraham. His descendants are going to go into the land. And then there's this whole difficulty with actually taking the land. In Joshua, things seem to be going really well, but then in Judges, where things seem to be going really badly. And then just when things seem to be settled with David and Solomon, things start to go downhill again. They get kicked out of the land. And some of these promises that you mentioned are right in the thick of it, where they're sitting in exile. They're like, what's going on? And God is saying, you will come back to the land, everything's, but the descendancy is just a given. It's the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
It's this, yeah, well, I mean, why would you even question that? But when you get into the New Testament, it seems to flip those things around. The land seems to be this kind of taken as a given in a sense, at least insofar as they're
speaking about the most, yeah.
Yeah, but the descendancy is like you said, it's this huge change that's been brought about. Now suddenly Gentiles are being welcomed into Abraham's family, and I don't know what to do with you. There are big fights going on with the law, and so I mean, these Gentiles don't want to keep the law. What are we meant to do with them? And so you can see how that would be quite a difficult situation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think Yeah, it's interesting. It's like almost we don't recognize the New Testament speaking about the land because the Bible spends so much time speaking about the land that it doesn't just have one way to speak about the land. It's got all these different ways.
Yeah. It just expects that you're tracking, that you've been keeping up with the Old Testament storylines, so by the time you get to the New Testaments, it's familiar enough.
Yeah, which is why we do biblical theology, so we can see that today.
Yeah, make those connections. And reading the Bible is hard work, man.
Yeah, jeez. Yeah, I think that's what I would say about it. So yes, Jesus does fulfill it. Already not yet in the full out sense, and then the reason that the New Testament appears not to talk about it much is because it just talks about it in language we aren't looking for.
So we can move on to our second question then, if that is all right with you. Cool. So this is quite this picks up some of the things that we've just been talking about actually. You spend some time in Galatians 3 talking about Abraham's descendants. In chapter 4, he goes on to talk about Sarah and Hagar figuratively as representing two covenants. Could you say a bit more about that? So now we're picking up that descendants conversation. We're picking up that big controversy that seems to be going on in the New Testament. And there's this weird image that's coming up of, well, how exactly is Paul using this whole Sarah and Hagar situation? And I guess some of the issues are surrounding that. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think anyone who's read Galatians 4 and gotten to that point are like, they have the same thought the first time. They're like, what on earth is Paul talking about? Like, what is going on here? Is this how I'm supposed to read the Old Testament? Yeah. It's a really good question because it relates directly to the massive shift in, well, it relates to two things actually. So it relates first to the thing that we said throughout the talk on the Patriarch, which is that the promise was given to Abraham's descendants, but not all of Abraham's descendants, only those whom God calls, right? And we saw that sort of trace its way through the Bible and work its way out in different ways. So that is, and the core of what Paul's talking about there in Galatians 4, I think, is it 21 to 31? Let me just get it open here. 21 to 31. And you can see that, for instance, in 28, his conclusion is, now you brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. So that's what he's sort of, and he's including the Gentiles in that. And the second thing is that he's working from the conclusions that he's already made in Galatians 3, which is where we spent all our time in Galatians, which is that there's this new category now of descendancy of Abraham, namely spiritual descendancy. Okay, so given that, what is he talking about? So his argument in Galatians is that he's trying to respond to these people who want new Christians who are Gentiles to basically become Israelites. They haven't quite got that there's this new category of descendancy, and so they think that the right way for Gentiles to be God-fearers is for them to become legal descendants of Abraham, because that's really all that's available to them.
That would have meant keeping the law.
The law, getting circumcised, doing all of the offerings and stuff, and
observing Sabbaths.
Observing the Sabbaths, and that's a good one actually. That's a big one that comes up in the New Testament a few times. Yeah, and so this is where like Acts 15, where the Council of Jerusalem comes, and they're like, no, Gentiles can be God's people and stay Gentiles, and it's them sort of realizing that there's this new category, there's this new way of being a descendant of Abraham, and so. What this means is that in how the Holy Spirit has revealed things, in the fact that he's come upon Gentiles before they become legal descendants, he's revealed this new category, and that means that now the descendants of the promise are the spiritual descendants of Abraham. Okay, so who the promised descendants are, who God has called, has now evolved quite in this dramatic way through Jesus. Namely, we now have a new class of descendant. And that those are now the people whom God has called. And that's open, I try to make this clear in the talk, that's not like excluding physical or legal descendants. They can become spiritual descendants. It's just that you don't have to, if you're a spiritual descendant, you don't have to become physical or legal in order for it to be legitimate. So now he's talking to these people who haven't quite got this yet, right? They haven't realized that the descendants of the promise have evolved quite dramatically in Jesus. And so they're still expecting people to live in the old category. So they're expecting these Gentiles to become legal descendants. And the Gentiles are unfortunately a bit... the Gentiles in Galatia, at least, were a bit slightly convinced of this. So Paul gets quite bleak at them when he's like, why do you...
Who bewitched you?
Why are you... Yeah, who tricked you? Yeah, who bewitched you? Yeah. So the way that he explains this now in Galatians 4, verse 21 to 31, with this allegory or figurative language, this metaphor, if you could call it that, is actually really provocative, okay? So he says, tell me, you who desire to be under the law, that is, you people who want Christians to be legal descendants, do not listen to the law, he's not referring to like the legal law, but the Torah. So he's referring to that story with Hagar and Sarah. And he draws this analogy between Hagar, who gave birth to Ishmael, who was a physical descendant of Abraham, but not the descendant of the promise, remember, because the promise came through Isaac. And then, so there's that one analogy. Sorry, not that one part. And then the other part is Isaac, who is the child of the promise who came from Sarah. And he's saying, right now what's happening is, you Jewish people, you Judaizers who want these Gentiles to become legal descendants, as if they were as if they were physical descendants, you are like fighting for Ishmael. You're like on Ishmael's side now, because what you've done is you're putting so much stock in this physical descendancy from Abraham and the legal descendancy that sort of tries to approximate it, and you to the point that you're actually ignoring how the descendancy of promise has evolved through Jesus, which is what's represented by Sarah and Isaac. And this is like crazy, right? Because these Jewish people that he's talking to would have identified with Isaac, right? Because they descended physically from Isaac and Jacob, and then through the nation of Israel and so on. So he's actually saying like you are acting like people outside of the chosen people with how you're doing. That's sort of the analogy he's drawing, right? So you've got Ishmael's a physical descendant, but not a child of the promise, and that's what's happening to these Jews who are rejecting God's work in the promise through Jesus, in opening up this category of spiritual descendants. So that's the first thing, which is just like such a provocative analogy to draw to these people. And then the second thing is he kind of layers it on a little bit. So it's pretty cool what he does. He quotes, I think it's Isaiah. Let me get my footnotes here, or my cross-references, so I can not just lie to you. Yeah, he quotes Isaiah. He says, "Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more, and those of the one who has a husband." Okay, so he's in the image that he's quoting there. It's of a barren woman who doesn't have a husband and can't bear children, and a woman who does have who does have a husband and can bear children. And he's saying in this language that he's saying, the barren woman will have more. So whatever God's going to be doing, it's going to like turn things upside down and do crazy things, right? And I think in the original context, he's talking about Jerusalem. So he's saying like Jerusalem at that point is in exile, and so it's like barren. But one day in this restoration of Israel, you will have, we'll be way more blessed than the people that you consider blessed right now. But he's drawn this analogy now, because you'll remember that Sarah was famously barren for like a really long time. So he's extending she didn't have a child for a very long time. That was the whole challenge of Sarah and Abraham, and why they had Ishmael through Hagar in the first place. So he started this very provocative analogy between Ishmael and the Jews who aren't turning to Christ, or aren't recognizing the spiritual descendancy, and then the Jews and Gentiles who are recognizing the spiritual descendancy, or are spiritual descendants. And now he's going a step further, and he's connecting the barren Sarah with the barren Jerusalem, and saying how that fulfillment, he's like almost, equivocating, but he's like almost connecting that image, that metaphor of Sarah and the metaphor of Jerusalem with the current restoration that's going on now. So he's saying that restoration has happened, and it's happened in such a way that the Gentiles have been included as spiritual descendants of Abraham. And you are asking to be enslaved to the law rather than accept the freedom that comes through Christ, which is quite an awesome thing. And that again is connected to Hagar and Sarah, because Sarah was the free woman and Hagar was, he refers to her as a slave woman in the story. It's like, yeah.
Just a few chapters later in Isaiah, it actually talks about the Gentiles and those who would have been excluded actually being engrafted in. Let no foreigner who is bound to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. And let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree.
Yeah, there you go. That's awesome. So it's the same. So Paul's really just provocatively telling his fellow Jews, listen, or those who are, not all his fellow Jews, but those who are rejecting what's happened. Yeah, the Judaizers, yeah. He's saying, you're setting yourself against what God is doing in the restoration that he promised. Because and in doing so, you're kind of holding on to the enslavement to sin that you had under the law, and not accepting the freedom that God has on offer to both Jew and Gentile in Christ as spiritual descendants of Abraham, which is like quite a, yeah, which is so hectic.
So in some sense, he's actually telling them, guys, read Isaiah. Go read your Bibles. You see that you're talking nonsense.
Yeah, he's saying read Isaiah. Yeah. By the way, if anyone's listening to this, or if listeners are interested, the paper that I referenced in the advanced level resources called "Children of Promise" by Gunther Juncker, that's basically the entire paper is dedicated to discussing this question. So if you want more detail than what we can say here, then I would highly recommend looking there.
Great stuff. I think that's all we got then. Thanks for joining us. This has been our second questions video. Our third lesson is coming out tomorrow evening, same time. So tune in for that. You can find it on our website, faithseekingunderstanding.co.za, on the Through His People page. Or otherwise, if you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, then you can find it there too. Don't forget to get your questions in by Friday. We run these pre-recorded question sessions on Saturday mornings, so it would be really helpful to have your questions before then, just so we can get our ducks in a row, just so we know what it is that we've got on the table to talk about. The earlier the better, so that we can put some thought and research into it if we need to. We want to answer your questions well, but at any time when they come up, whenever you get around to watching the lesson, provided we can get them before Friday, go ahead and ask your questions.